And welcome to Healing Heart to Heart. I'd like to introduce you to Tod Smith, Chaplain at San Juan Regional Medical Center. Tod, would you please share some of your thoughts and wisdom about a community healing from the type of tragedy that we've just experienced?
Well, that's a huge thing to even consider. The number of people who've been impacted, directly, indirectly. Everybody's going to experience it differently. Everyone is going to process that experience differently. And we've talked a few times, and one of the things I think is important for people to consider is that when you have an experience like this, you have almost any experience, and it comes into your life and it becomes a part of you, you are changed. You are not the same person that you've always been. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to be the same person to your family or your friends, but there may be a slight shift in your sense of who you are and how people experience you. And I think that's probably true for the community as well. It's not going to be the same community. Going forward, holidays in that community might feel differently. The administration and the teachers are all going to handle their classrooms maybe slightly differently. It may not be noticeable, but there is a shift, I think, that comes from the grieving process. And it's important to know that everybody does it differently. Grief is, and it's hard to talk about sometimes. We don't have words. That's one thing I've discovered, I think, as a chaplain, is that people, including myself to some degree, we don't have a very good vocabulary to talk about our feelings and the depth of our feelings. Usually we leave it to mad, sad, bad, glad. And we don't know how to talk about some of those deeper feelings of disappointment or shame, as you mentioned earlier. We were talking, and where are those? What do those even mean? And sometimes, in my work, sometimes as I sit with families or a patient, I'll just reach out and I'll guess. I'll take a stab at it and I'll say, "You must be really scared." Or I'll say it even more directly, "You're scared." And that gives them the chance or the freedom to kind of ponder that and say, "No, I'm just really angry." Or I'm really sad. Or, whatever it might be, it helps them to kind of clarify what it is that maybe I'm observing and that I'm hearing from them. So that, I guess, being the point that everybody experiences it differently. It's hard to articulate it sometimes. I guess another big element to this that I would say is that I often hear people talking about getting past their grief or moving through their grief or getting over their grief or whatever. Now, I'm pretty sure that it never goes away. I talk with people who are in their 8th and 9th decades of life, and as we chat, and this is something I've been surprised by, the sheer number of people who have lost children at all stages of that child's life, as infants, newborns, infants, toddlers, school kids, young adults, adults. And, it may have happened 20 or 30 years ago, but when that surfaces in our conversation, there is a perceptible shift in their affect, their emotional. You can see it and hear it. And I will often say, "It's like it happened last week." And they'll often tear up and say, "Yeah, it feels that way." So that never quite goes away. I saw somebody do a demonstration once talking about how we sometimes bury those emotions or bury those feelings that are uncomfortable and they're distressing. We don't want to feel those, so we want to push them away. And this friend of mine that gave this presentation, he always said, and I say it now, that if you bury those, you bury them alive, because they never really go away. And he would demonstrate this with a tuning fork. It was very powerful. He'd take a tuning fork and tap it, and it would hum, and he would set it on a table. And he'd take another tuning fork, and he would set it over here on the table without tapping it. And only seconds later, this tuning fork began to hum as well. And because those vibrations would go all the way through the table. So you go through life, and triggers and things that bring back those memories and those experiences suddenly surface. All that emotion that is still there, still part of you. So don't push it away. Don't fight it. In fact, embrace it. Allow yourself to experience those unpleasant feelings of sadness and anger and fear and frustration and whatever it may be. Don't run from those. So, were you going to ask me something? I think you were.
I was, but you partially answered the question. I was going to say, what do you suggest people do when their grief surfaces?
Mm-hmm.
And you said embrace it. Do you have advice in addition to that?
Well, of course, there are ample resources in our communities of counselors and professionals and clergy who are, and myself, more than happy to sit down and find time to engage and talk about these and listen. And I think to embrace these, sometimes, as I said earlier, grief is a very lonely, very isolated kind of an experience because it's all inside you. The day looks the same, the sun is up, and music is playing, and you hear laughter of the kids in the backyard, but this piece of grief that is just blanketing you makes you feel alone. So connecting to others is really, really important. In fact, most current definitions of spirituality include the idea of connection with yourself, making sure that you're not shoving stuff away and dissociating those things, connection with others, connection with the things that have meaning to you, whether it's music or art or cooking or whatever those things might be that have been important to you. Those are important to hang on to. But the idea of connection. And so a resource like this where people can come online and hear examples of other people who are experiencing this, or that what you're doing is you're reaching out to connect. And so that connection is really, really important. And sort of the flip side of spirituality is spiritual distress. And so as I do my work, and I try to get our nurses and others to help me identify this, is looking for patients who are, and families and staff who are maybe experiencing some kind of spiritual distress. It's often related to a loss. It's often related to sort of a pile up of loss and grief that hasn't been tended to. But the distress factor also talks about an impaired ability to connect, to maintain those connections with yourself and with others. So if you see people isolating, that's likely what's going on. So I don't know if I answered your question.
You answered it very well.
There's one thing, I thought about this driving into work today because I knew we were going to be doing this. And I remembered an experience I had early on here at this hospital. And nobody ever taught me this. I never read it, I don't think. But I experienced it and learned it. And like I said to you earlier, in my opinion, everything is curriculum. But I was on a floor, kind of doing my rounds and visits, and there was a large family gathering around a room of a patient who was sort of in the last stages of their life, literally, minutes, hours maybe. And this family, it was such a large family, they couldn't all fit in the room, and they resisted the idea of all splitting and going to the waiting area. They wanted to be together. And so I didn't make a big deal out of it, but I always had to kind of excuse myself to navigate through this big crowd. And they were hugging, and there were tears, and they were grieving. This entire group was grieving. And what I discovered was that grief is contagious. I began to feel it. I had nothing to do with this particular patient. They had not asked for me, and they had their own support system, and they were doing pretty good in this process. They didn't need me. But I also noticed that the nurses began to, in my opinion, they began to kind of slow down in their processes, and they weren't interacting with each other or me as much. And I began to talk to them, and we all identified that we were. It was like we were sponges, and we were absorbing this grief from this crowd around us. I guess maybe that's partly what empathy is about. That makes us all human. That makes us spiritual entities. That, like those tuning forks, that whole crowd was humming, and all I had to do was go by, and I began to hum. And I didn't really understand it at first, but after a while, I thought, why do I feel so heavy? Why do I feel weary? Why do I feel so prepared, I guess is a good way to say it. And it finally occurred to me because of what's going on around me. So pay attention to that as well, I guess.
And do you have some suggestions? Because from a spiritual standpoint, if grief is contagious, being uplifted from it could be as well.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have some suggestions on how we can lift each other up while we are also in the midst of this process?
Yeah. Well, that's good. My core belief is that in terms of who we are as God's creation, is that I always refer to us as pack animals. We're supposed to be in a group. We're not supposed to go through life alone. And if you're going through life alone, without a community around you, even a small community, it's like walking a tightrope without a net, because something's going to push you off at some point. You need those people around you to catch you. So those groups become important, whether it's a group at your church. And for years, I was a small groups pastor in a variety of larger churches where my job was just to help create opportunities for these communities to come together. So I've seen it happen. I've seen people come to life almost because suddenly they're with other people. And so yes, resist the isolation that you feel you want to do. Now, and I'm an introvert, so I understand, and I have to get away. I have to withdraw periodically to keep my own sanity and health. But then I have to go back in and be with those that I care about. So don't isolate any more than you need to. Go to church. Find that little dinner group. Another family who's maybe in a similar spot from this horrible event. Your kids know kids who know kids who lost a friend. It's sort of this down the road kind of thing, this connection, but it's still there. Get with some of those people. Have dinner. Go out to dinner. You don't have to talk about the event even necessarily, but be there for each other to allow life to continue to somewhat be normal, but also to acknowledge it. So it's kind of a two-fisted thing. But I would say don't be alone. Be in groups.
Thank you, Tod.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing from your heart, and thank you for the support that you're giving with our community.
Wish I could do more.